You always see a spot, you always see a place when you're in that mode, because it's really a mindset. And once you're in that mindset, then geography and everything becomes very different. You see everywhere in a very different way.
I suppose the thing which first got me interested in tagging was just the kind of youth culture. You know, where I grew up in the suburbs. I was first interested in skateboard culture, and hip hop culture, and it was just kind of tagging was just one of those kind of creative or activities which was just part of the youth culture at the time. Subway art or spray can art. Tagging is basically the most basic form of graffiti writing, separate from just kind of regular graffiti, you know, which can have a myriad of forms. It's almost like describing music. There are so many different variations of it. There's prison graffiti, gang graffiti, toilet graffiti, political graffiti, stencil graffiti, all these different types of graffiti. And tagging is basically the heart of graffiti writing.
A tag is a signature. It's a small kind of communication that, as a writer, it's the very first point of getting that name and building a persona. It creates a story around yourself, and you know how your tag is written, where it's placed. All of these sort of elements into bombing are different communications which put together tell a story.
There was a graffiti writer called Taki183. He was a mail boy, apparently, in New York City, and he went round dropping off the mail all around New York. And when he was doing that, he would write his tag Taki183 in different parts of the city, and that was eventually written up. And so when he did that, he really, you know, I think when that was in the New York Times, that really spurned up the whole movement. People saw like, wow, this kid's famous. You know, what's he done? All he's done is write his name. It was only a very short article, but I think it had a big impact. Have you ever actually seen that book before?
I haven't seen it, but
in the flesh.
It's sort of no, but it's legendary, you know. So it's sort of like, and you know, it is a celebration of that original, just the tag, and what that means, and how prolific it was, and how much part of New York it was at that time.
If you're young, young teenager, it's kind of like a fun thing to do. Very much like skateboarding is a fun thing to do. It's almost like a kind of recreational sport. Then these other aspects come into it as well. This kind of idea of selfhood and ownership. There's a kind of idea of ownership, or you know, the more you write your tag around the city or the urban environment, the more you maybe start to feel an ownership of those locations.
There is definitely a type of person that gets into graffiti writing, you know, and it is around adolescence. You know, it is just before adolescence that, you know, usually young males start, and it's usually about something that's going on in their lives in a wider sense. Maybe there are issues at home with parents. Maybe they just don't feel they fit in.
Tagging quite possibly is a lot of bored kids, but the way that you can start to begin to understand tagging, if you're interested, which most people probably aren't and probably never will be, which in a way I think is good for tagging because it keeps its kind of resonance and it keeps its subcultural element. But when you become interested in it, it's kind of like looking at the art of calligraphy. I think is probably the easiest way of starting to kind of try to quantify it. And but it's not a typical standard calligraphy, and there are various traditions and styles and retro styles that are going on in this tagging that you see around the place. So you might see a tag which looks like it was done in 1972 and it has all these kind of old dots and stars around it, and it on first glance you might think that's a really bad, lame tag, but then you might realise it's actually a kind of it's been deliberately done badly, or deliberately done in a naive, not badly, but deliberately done in a naive kind of retro style. obsessive fans of tagging. There are people from the culture generally who are interested in it, and there are certain theorists and perhaps philosophers and stuff like that who look at public space and ownership of public space and the idea of who talks in public space. So there are theorists and sociologists looking at these areas. What I think is interesting is there's the philosopher John Baudrillard, who's a very highly esteemed French philosopher who was associated with ideas like hyperreality and the idea of the sign and the symbol. And he wrote in 1974 this kind of quite famous essay called Cool Killer, or The Insurrection of the Signs, which is an interesting short essay about tagging in New York in the early 70s. And his one of his basic points is that tagging is a kind of authentic gesture that has credibility where perhaps other high art forms don't have such credibility or authenticity, because they're essentially, according to him, kind of copies of a copy, whereas tagging is a kind of true authentic form. So I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think the idea of John Baudrillard being a supporter of tagging but not contemporary art is quite an interesting idea as well. Generally speaking, I think the public just don't like tagging because they don't understand it, and in a way they're not supposed to understand it. And so they just see it as these kind of hideous scrawls which have no kind of artistic merit. They just seem pointless. They just think it's just pointless vandalism, which in some senses may all be true, but there is more to it than just that. And I think it's harder. I think it's not so easy to dismiss as just this pointless activity. I think there are motives and there are things that it reflects about society and the world as part of it. So that's why I might disagree, and that's why I often argue the case for tagging. When people say to me, I like graffiti, but I don't like tagging, I'd always say, well, tagging is the heart of graffiti, and you can't just like the pretty, pretty colourful stuff, but not, like the kind of real deal.